Side 4. The family settled down by the fire. The box of chocolates was passed around. Mrs. Watson sighted her footstool. Mr. Watson polished his glasses with a special cloth impregnated with silicones. They all sat in expectation. The first thing that happened was that as the television set warmed up, it gave out an electronic howl, which climbed the scale until it was like a knife driven through the teeth, and then sank to a scream. "It's a tuning note," said Mrs. Watson. "Doesn't sound like it to me," said David. "Turn it down a bit, Frank, till it's warmed up," said Mrs. Watson. "It'll be all right." The scream died and broke into a staccato cough. "That's not a tuning note," said David. The television set blinked, and for a second they glimpsed the head and shoulders of an announcer, and then it looked as if a motorcycle had ridden over his face, leaving the tread marks on the screen and dragging his nose and ears sideways out of the picture. "It's the contrast, Frank." Mr. Watson heaved himself from his chair and began to turn the controls. He was too near to see if he was doing any good. It seemed to be raining in the studio. "That's better," said Mrs. Watson. "No, you've gone too far. Back. Oh, that's no good. Try the other way." The screen became alternately a dazzling silver and a blackness shot through with meteorites. "Let me have a go, Dad," said David. "Don't interfere," said Mrs. Watson. "Your father knows what he's doing. Now, there. There, that's better." It was still raining, but they could tell that some horses were galloping round a circus ring. Mr. Watson went back to his chair. At that moment, the picture began to float upwards. It was followed by another, a leisured string of pictures. Plop, plop, plop. "Your vertical hold's gone," said David. Mr. Watson tramped across the room and turned another knob with gentle fury. The pictures slowed. Mr. Watson was breathing through his moustache. The picture stopped, half out of the frame. A black band through the middle of the screen. Above were galloping hoofs, below horses' heads and nodding plumes. "Ease it up," said Mrs. Watson. "It's coming. It's coming. Oh, too much." The pictures shot into a fuzz. Mr. Watson spun the knob in both directions, but it had no effect. He turned all the controls separately and together. He switched the set off and on again several times. He tried other channels. Nothing worked. "Oh, leave it off," said Mrs. Watson. "It would happen on a Friday." "Never mind," said Mr. Watson. "I'll phone the shop first thing in the morning." "That's not now, is it? What are we going to do?" "There's tonight's paper, dear, if you'd like to look at that." "Oh, very well. Thank you." Mrs. Watson took the evening paper and made a point of reading it. Every minute or so she would turn the pages fretfully and hit them into shape, as if they were responsible for the television breakdown. Mr. Watson sat in his chair, gazing at the fire. David and Roland brought themselves books from upstairs. Nicholas started to glance through a pile of magazines. Helen doodled on the cover of one of the magazines, giving a film star a moustache, beard, and glasses. "Isn't it quiet?" she said. "I'm going to listen to my transistor," said Nicholas. "That's a good idea," said Mrs. Watson. "Fetch it down, Nick. It'll be nice to have some music if we're reading." "I think I'll just try the TV again," said Mr. Watson. "You never know." "Don't," said Mrs. Watson. "It'll only make you bad-tempered. We'll listen to the wireless, and then I'll bring the supper. I shan't be sorry to have an early bed tonight. It's been a tiring week." "Have you messed up my transistor?" said Nicholas from the doorway. He was looking at David, and his face was hot. "Why should I want to touch your puny transistor when I built a real wireless of my own?" said David. "Someone has," said Nicholas. Is it either of you two?" "Not me," said Roland. "What's wrong with it?" "You listen," said Nicholas, and he pushed the button of his portable radio. A whooping noise rose and fell against a background of atmospheric crackle that drowned any broadcast. "It's the same on all stations. It was okay this morning, so who's wrecked it?" "Wait a minute," said David. He put down his book and ran upstairs. "I promise we've not touched your wireless," said Helen. "No one's been in your room all day, Nick," said Mrs. Watson. "That's another washout, then," said Nicholas. He flopped into the chair and snatched open a magazine. "My radio's conked too," David called. "It must be a magnetic storm." "Would it stop the TV?" said Mrs. Watson. "No," said David. "That doesn't work the same way." Nobody could sit still for long. It was so unnatural for the room to be quiet. There was a tension in the silence, as if a clock had stopped. Mr. Watson thumbed the pages of a gardening catalogue. He whistled a tune to himself, but it wasted away. Every small movement made someone look up, and every sound was an irritation. Then, into this silence, there broke the noise of a car engine. It hiccuped on one cylinder, hesitated, and the remaining cylinders fired. Mr. Watson dropped his catalogue. "That's our car," he said. "Nonsense, Frank. I tell you it's our car." He pulled back the curtain that stopped the draught from the front door, slid the catch, and ran out onto the footpath in his carpet slippers. "Frank, you'll catch your death!" They all chased after Mr. Watson and came upon him standing outside the padlocked garage door. Inside the garage, the car engine throbbed, about to stall. "Go and bring a torch and the key, Nick," said Mr. Watson. The engine picked up again. "Who can it be? How's he broken in?" said Mrs. Watson. "I don't know, dear," said Mr. Watson. "It's very funny." "Perhaps it's a ghost," said David. "David!" said Mrs. Watson. "Oh, no. Do you think it is?" said Helen. "Of course not. You see what happens when you say stupid things?" "Sorry, Mum," said David. "Only a joke." Even so, when Nicholas had brought the key and Mr. Watson unlocked the door, everyone felt a creeping of the scalp as the door swung open. The car stood in a haze of exhaust smoke. Nobody was in the garage. The ignition was switched off, and the key was in Mr. Watson's pocket. He sat in the driving seat and frowned at the dashboard. "Ah-huh," he said with an attempt at understanding. "Ah." "What is it, Dad?" said Nicholas. "I'd not put the choke right back in." Mr. Watson stuck his finger against one of the knobs. The engine died. "There'd be just enough petrol seeping through to fire the engine," he said. "Now then, all inside, out of the cold. The mystery's solved. Come on." "But, Dad," Roland heard David say as he helped Mr. Watson shut the door, "you'd still need the ignition on to start the motor, wouldn't you?" If Mr. Watson replied, Roland didn't hear him. The diversion made half an hour pass. It was good to come to the fire from the dark, and they gathered round the hearth, warming their hands and talking away the uneasiness they'd all felt in front of the locked garage. But the heat of the fire drove them apart to their own little islands in the room. Mr. and Mrs. Watson faced each other in armchairs. David and Roland, with their shoes off, were competing from behind their books for an unfair share of the sofa. Nicholas sat on a leather poof, reading the advice columns in all the magazines. Helen was drawing heads in profile, looking to the left. She could never draw them looking to the right. The evening dribbled by. "Hark!" said Mrs. Watson. "What's that?" "I can't hear anything," said Mr. Watson. "It's upstairs." The whole family listened. "Oh, yes," said Helen. "It's a sort of buzzing." "Shut up a minute, then," said David. "I can't—" "Oh, yes." "Go and see what it is, Frank," said Mrs. Watson. "The immersion heater may not be plugged in properly." "Then shall we have supper?" said Mr. Watson. "I could do with a bite." His soft, heavy tread creaked on the stairs. "Oh, what's your father up to, I wonder?" said Mrs. Watson after several minutes. "Has he gone to bed? It'd be just like him." "No," said Roland. "He's coming." "That noise is louder, too." Mr. Watson came downstairs as slowly as he'd climbed. He halted in the doorway of the room. His face was blank with unbelief. In one hand, he held his electric razor. The razor was working, although in his other hand, Mr. Watson held the loose end of the flex. "It's my razor," he said. "Well, can't you stop it?" said Mrs. Watson. "Can't you switch it off?" "There's nothing to switch off. You plug it into the light." "But that's ridiculous, Frank. It's not plugged into anything. You must be able to switch it off." "I can't, dear. It works from the mains." "Then what's it doing now?" "I don't know, dear." Mr. Watson put the razor on the table. Its vibrations made it turn like the head of a tortoise. "It was in its case on top of the medicine cupboard. It had nearly shaken itself off. I had a job to catch it." "Dead weird, isn't it?" said Nicholas. "The power must be coming from somewhere, unless there's a fault." "There's no fault in the razor," said David. "It's going perfectly." "I don't like it," said Helen. "It's almost alive." "It's spooky." "David," said Mrs. Watson, "I will not have you putting such thoughts into other people's heads. You know there must always be a perfectly simple explanation for everything that happens. There's obviously something wrong with the razor, and we'll take it back to the shop tomorrow and let a qualified electrician see it." "I'll wrap it in a towel and put it away," said Mr. Watson, "or else it'll get on our nerves. I must say, I wouldn't have thought it." "Now we're all up, let's have supper," said Mrs. Watson. "Will you bring the trolley through, please, Roland, for the cups and saucers? I'll go and put the kettle on." "It's still pretty spooky, whatever Mum says," David muttered. "Now, David," said his father. "Well, it is, Dad. You can't run away from it. Things don't start by themselves. You must have something to—" Mrs. Watson's scream interrupted him. They rushed through into the kitchen and found her staring at the electric food mixer, which was spinning at top speed. "Switch it off!" cried Mrs. Watson. "It is switched off, Mum," said Nicholas, and he took the plug out of the socket to be certain. The mixer did not falter. "It started," said Mrs. Watson. "I was nowhere near it." "Now will you believe me?" said David. As if to back him up, the drum of the washing machine slowly began to turn behind its glass door. "It's all right, dear," said Mr. Watson. "There'll be a fault in the supply. David, go and switch off the mains, and we'll see." David pressed a lever on the electricity meter, and all the lights in the house went out. But the mixer and the washing machine threshed away in the darkness. "Very well," said Mr. Watson. "Put the lights on." They ate a poor supper. Mrs. Watson was upset, but Mr. Watson said that nothing could be done at the moment, and that they should try to have a good night's sleep. It would all be put right in the morning. It was not a fault at the mains, so there was no danger. Nevertheless, he gave himself away by setting up a camp bed for Helen in his room. Now, no one would be alone. At first, the boys tried to talk when they were in bed, but their father called to them to go to sleep. So they lay awake through that night, listening to the machinery. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the food mixer burned itself out, but the washing machine rumbled on. The children and their parents stared clear-eyed at the dark. Chapter 11. The Last Spadeful. "What was that you were chuntering about last night, Roland, before Dad told you to shut up?" said Nicholas. "I know what's causing all this," said Roland. "It's the treasures." Mrs. Watson was in bed, suffering from a headache. She'd put cotton wool in her ears to keep out the noise of the washing machine. Mr. Watson was having trouble over finding an electrician. Either the numbers were engaged, or he became involved in long arguments. "I don't know how they're doing it," said Roland, "but they are. Malebron said they'd still give light in Elidor even when they're here, So they must be generating something. Generators, said David. Yes, they could. Roland, you've hit it. If Malebron said that, the treasures must be giving off energy. And if it's generated over a wide enough range of frequencies, it'll spoil TV and radio reception, and it'll turn electric motors. Does that mean that as long as I'm looking after a stone, I'll not be able to use my transistor? Said Nicholas. It depends what the range is, said David, but probably you won't. It fits with what happened when I went to collect them, said Roland. The GPO van and all that static. The van makes sense, said David, but generators don't generate static electricity. And if the treasures are generators... There's a lot of if in this, said Nicholas. But we'll have to do something quickly, said Roland. We can't hide the treasures for long. They'll be found and taken away from us. There'll be another van looking for them this morning, I bet, unless we can stop the interference they're causing. The only thing to do is to try and screen them, said David. If we put them in a metal box and bury them, it should block out most of the interference, if the energy is anything like electricity, and it must be even in Elidor. That's what I said we should do at the start, said Nicholas. Dig a hole and bury 'em. It's a bit thick if I can't listen to the radio. And anyway, we look so daft carting these things round. You and Roland playing soldiers with bits of iron and wood, and Helen at a doll's tea party, and me... What am I doing, looking after a lump of stone as if it were the crown jewels? But Malebron trusted us to look after them, said Roland. We can't let him down. And Elidor... You give me the pip sometimes, said Nicholas. You really do. All right, I was as excited as you when it happened. But what is it, once you've got used to the idea? Is it any better than our world? It's all mud and dust and rock. It's dead, finished. Malebron said so. And you should think about him a bit more, too. Did he care how we made out as long as he found his treasures? He sent us trotting off into that mound, one after the other, but he didn't go in himself. What right has he to expect us to spend the rest of our lives like broody hens? But you saw him, said Roland. How can you forget him if you've seen him? Nicholas shrugged his shoulders. Oh, well, he said, Well, I didn't say anything was wrong with him. He was just self-centered. Look, do stop arguing, said Helen. Honest, Roland, if David's right, then what Nick wants to do is best, even if you don't like why he's doing it. Now, what's all this noise? Said Mr. Watson. The washing machine had covered his approach. You know your mother's got a bad head. Sorry, Dad, said David. Any luck? It's very strange, said Mr. Watson. But every single electrician says he's been having calls all night, and no one can promise to come before this afternoon. So it wasn't just us, said David. It's intolerable, said Mr. Watson. Your poor mother didn't sleep a wink. I'm going round to the electricity office now to insist that they do something immediately. It can't go on. Can we dig in the garden, please? Said Helen. Yes, anything you like, said Mr. Watson. As long as you don't disturb your mother. She's dropped off. We'll have to bury the treasures, said David as soon as their father had gone. If they've been causing all this trouble, the electricity people or the post office will find them. It's the only way, Roland. David and I'll take first go at the digging, said Nicholas. We'll have to make it deep, and Dad won't think much of it if he comes back before we've finished. Helen and Roland went upstairs and brought down 4 polythene bags to hold the treasures. It was hard to squash all the air out of the bags so that they would take up as little space as possible. Helen fastened the necks with rubber bands and covered this seal with a lashing of twine. Roland found an old dustbin among the rubbish that had been cleared out of the cottage and was waiting to be removed from the bottom of the garden. The treasures looked no different. A stone, a piece of railing, 2 laths, and a cup. Roland put them into the dustbin and tied the lid down with a length of flex from David's radio spares. When Helen and Roland climbed into the hole, it was up to their chests. The sides were mottled layers of earth, darkest at the top, growing lighter and sandier towards the bottom, and veined brown with dead roots. Shards of pottery winked blue and white in the soil. "Have you noticed," said Helen, "wherever you dig, there's always millions of broken plates. It was the same at the other house. People must have been throwing them away for years." They were head-deep in almost pure sand, and they could barely lift the spade loads to clear the pile at the edge of the hole. "You'll do at that," said David. "It's the best we can manage in the time. Give us your hand and I'll pull you out." "Right," said Helen. "Last spadeful coming up." "Oh!" She drove the spade into the sand, and it hit something which cracked. Helen knelt and picked out several fragments of earthenware. "Oh, I think it was a whole jug," she said, "and I've smashed it. Look, Roland, oh, isn't it lovely?" She wiped a piece with her hand. It was a creamy brown colour, with a blue tinge of lead in the glaze, and there were the head and forelegs of a unicorn, lined in dark red. "Gosh, it must be centuries old," said Roland. "I'm going to mend it," said Helen. "Oh, what a pity. If only I hadn't broken it. I'd give anything not to have broken it." "We'll be copped if you don't hurry up," said Nicholas. Helen and Roland were pulled out of the hole, and the dustbin was lowered in. They kicked and shovelled the earth back and stamped it down. "There," said Nicholas. When they went into the kitchen to clean their hands, the washing machine had stopped. Chapter 12. The Letterbox. Electricians checked the house and went away again. Mr. Watson made a flower bed on the heap of soil where the treasures were buried. A year passed, and all this time Roland avoided using the front door. He felt that he could never trust the door to be the way out of and into the cottage. It became a compulsion, like walking on curbstones. Helen mended the jug she had found in the hole. It was a large pitcher, and it had broken into 5 pieces. She spent hours gluing them together, almost in tears when she thought of what she'd done. The pitcher had lain in the ground such a long time, and such a little care would have saved it. Now she was too late, and nothing could make it whole again. The unicorn reared below the lip, poised at the heightened stillness of movement. An instant later, Helen thought, and it would have been gone. There was no other decoration, except for 2 lines of thick black lettering under the unicorn. "Save, maid that is makeless, no man with me mell." "What does it mean, Dad?" said Nicholas. "I'm not sure," said Mr. Watson. "It's some sort of verse. Perhaps it's a family motto. Something like, you know, that Scottish one. 'He gets hurt who meddles with me.'" "What's a makeless maid?" said Roland. "Well, it's hard to say exactly. I suppose you could find it in the dictionary." "You made a very good job of mending that, Helen," said Mrs. Watson. "You can't really see the cracks." "But I know they're there," said Helen. The year passed. It was a dark Sunday afternoon. Helen and Nicholas had gone for a ride on their bicycles. David and Roland were sitting at the table in the middle room, revising the work they had done at school that term. Through the window, they could see their mother and father in the garden. Mr. Watson was planting some rose bushes. Roland tried to concentrate on his history book. He had to read 20 pages, and he found that he was more aware of the number of a page than of what was printed on it. Eventually the words became a procession, and his mind drifted from them first to the tablecloth and then to the window. He saw that David was drawing patterns in the margin of his notebook. "Revision's the worst part of the term, isn't it?" said Roland. "You think you know the stuff, but you don't. And you can't take it in because you've heard it all before and it's gone stale." "I can't get used to not having a front garden," said David. "Every time someone goes past the house, I think they're coming here. And that front door's driving me round the bend." "Oh," said Roland. "Why?" "It keeps buzzing," said David. "Haven't you noticed? It must be traffic that makes it vibrate. Anyway, what with that and the footpath right next to the house, you can't think straight even in here. I've never liked the porch, said Roland. I used it to open the mound, and ever since it's felt wrong. What? Said David. Open what? The mound, said Roland. In Elidor. Oh, that, said David. What do you mean, oh, that, said Roland. Elidor, 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 have you forgotten? Okay, said David. We don't want the whole road to hear. Elidor, said Roland. So why can't we talk about it? You and Nick always change the subject. I think you ought to cool down a bit on this Elidor business, said David. You're mad, said Roland. All right, said David. We had been talking about it. I don't remember, said Roland. Nick said you'd only start getting worked up, and we'd have a row, so we didn't tell you. Good old Nick, said Roland. He would. Thanks very much. You see, said David, you're shouting already. But you're pretending it doesn't matter, said Roland. Didn't it mean anything to you? Malebron and the treasures, and that golden castle, and everything? Listen, said David. Nick's not all that dim, although you think he is. A lot of what he says makes sense, even if I don't agree with everything myself. What does he say, then? That there's no such place as Elidor, and we dreamed it? In a way, said David. He's off his head. No, he's gone into it more than any of us, said David. And he's been reading books. He says that it could all have been what he calls mass hallucination, perhaps something to do with shock after the church nearly fell on us. He says it does happen. And I suppose the mud we scraped off was a mass hallucination, said Roland. Yes, I know, said David. But I think he may be right about the treasures. Try to remember. When the church was shaking all round us, we couldn't see what we were doing, and we were falling all over the place, and everything jarred so much we didn't know where we were. That's true, isn't it? I suppose so. Well, said David, even if we were holding the real treasures, they could have been knocked out of our hands, and we could have grabbed hold of the other things without noticing. I didn't, said Roland, but it is possible, said David. If you can believe that, you can believe in the treasures, said Roland. And what about the things that happened next? The television and Dad's razor, and your theory about generators? Yes, it was a bit rum, said David. But it could have been a coincidence. And anyway, it was a long time ago, and nothing's happened since. That's the whole point, said Roland. That's why we buried them. If we dug them up, it'd start all over again. There's not much chance of that, said David. Now that Dad's made his prize flower bed there, it'd be more than anyone's life's worth to touch it. David and Roland looked out of the window into the garden. Roland was about to go on with the argument, but what he saw stopped him. Mr. Watson was crouching a few feet away from a rose bush that he had just planted. Others lay nearby, their roots in bags. Very gingerly, and rather like a boxer, Mr. Watson sidled towards the flower bed. He stretched out his hand, flinching, nearer and nearer. Then he jumped back as if the bush had bitten him. The children watched him do this twice before they left their work and ran into the garden. "What's up, Dad?" said David. By this time, Mrs. Watson had joined her husband and was peering at the bush. "It's this Mrs. A.R. Barraclough," said Mr. Watson. "I keep getting a shock from it." "A shock?" No, not quite. But there's a distinct sound when I try to touch it, and I can feel a tingling in my hand." "Your hair's all frizzy too, Frank," said Mrs. Watson. "How very interesting. Look, David and Roland. There must be thunder about somewhere." She put her hand near the bush, and they all heard a sharp crack. "Be careful, dear," said Mr. Watson. "It's all right, Dad," said David. That's static electricity. Roland hurried to different parts of the garden, touching shrubs, trees, walls, fences. "There's nothing here," he called. He came back to the flower bed and put out his hand. Crack. "It's only this place." He looked hard at David. "Run and see if the glass is dropping, Roland," said Mrs. Watson. "I do hope Helen and Nick aren't going to be caught in a storm." Roland went into the house. His face was flushed and he was breathing quickly. The barometer hung on the sitting-room wall. The needle was slightly higher than it had been the previous day. "Coincidence," said Roland. "Huh." While he was reading the barometer, the front door vibrated. A short, resonant buzz, not very loud, but noticeable. He'd heard it before on several occasions, but it was only now, since David had complained about it, that the sound grated on him. The door buzzed again, a longer note. Roland turned from the barometer, and as he passed the door, he heard someone step into the porch. There was no mistaking this. The footpath had its own sound, and so had the porch. The flagstone gave a hard echo between the brick walls. Someone had stepped into the porch. Without waiting for the knock, Roland drew back the curtain. The upright letterbox in the top of the door was open, and pressed close against it, Roland saw an eye. He snatched the curtain across and held it tightly in place. He heard a slight movement, and the doorknob was turned both ways, and the door shifted against the Yale lock. He could hear breathing, too. "Who is it?" said Roland. No one answered. The door still buzzed. Roland dashed out into the garden. "There's someone trying to get in through the front door!" he shouted. It was so obvious that Roland was frightened that Mr. Watson dropped his spade and hurried round the side of the house to the footpath. Helen and Nicholas were wheeling their bicycles on the curb. "Who's in the porch?" said Mr. Watson. "I didn't notice anybody," said Nicholas. The porch was empty, and so was the road. "Why? What's the matter?" "Someone looked through the letterbox and tried to open the door," said Roland. "Now, about half a minute ago." "But they couldn't have," said Helen. "We were freewheeling to see who could get nearest to home without touching the pedals. We were ages coming down the road." "Nobody went anywhere near the house," said Nicholas. "Yes, they did," cried Roland. "I heard them. And when I pulled the curtain, there was this eye staring." "Who'd want to do that?" said Nicholas. "There'd be nothing to see but curtain." "Was it you frightening Roland, Nick?" said Mr. Watson. "Me? No. Because if it was, I've told you before I won't stand for it. You're old enough to know better than to play stupid tricks like that." "But it wasn't me, Dad." "Very well," said Mr. Watson. "But I don't want it to happen again, that's all." "I did see somebody," said Roland. "I did." "Now, come along inside, Roland," said Mrs. Watson. "You know you're your own worst enemy." "But, Mum, I did see somebody." "I don't doubt it," said Mrs. Watson. "But you mustn't let your imagination run away with you. You're too highly strung, that's your trouble. You'll make yourself ill if you're not careful." Roland was found to have a temperature of 101. Mrs. Watson gave him aspirin and sent him to bed, cooked him a light tea, and sat with him until he appeared to be calmer. When the other children went to bed, they were told to go quietly so as not to wake Roland. They tiptoed upstairs without switching the light on. "Come in here, you lot," said Roland. Chapter 13.